Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be able to welcome Ankit Panda to this ORF platform today to discuss his book, a very interesting new book, Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, Survival and Deterrence in North Korea, recently published by Oxford University Press and Hearst. It's Ankit has written extensively on this issue and a range of other issues he has been writing. He's presently the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, New York. His past publications have ranged from dealing with US foreign and defense policy, Asia Pacific security, and of course, non-proliferation and arms control. It's wonderful to be able to have him today for this conversation, not only about the book, but also some of the larger issues that it raises. So welcome, Ankit. Welcome to ORF and welcome to this platform.
Thank you, Harsh. It's a pleasure to be here with ORF. Looking forward to our discussion today.
So as I said, it's an amazing read for someone who who clearly does not know his North Korea. It's the way you present the trajectory of the nuclear program, the way you lay out the causes and the consequences arguments on both sides, and of course just the very fact that that an issue almost a global problem that had always been this very, very well guarded by a very, very small group of people who have been observing it, from policymakers to academics. It has not generated the kind of discussions perhaps that at one point Indian and Chinese and Pakistani programs generated. So it's wonderful, I think, to be able to put this all in context and to also raise some of the broader issues about policy, both from American foreign policy perspective as well as for the larger nuclear arms control and non-proliferation architecture. But before we go to those issues, I would just like to start by asking you one of those questions that every author has to answer. What attracted you to this book? In a sense that I know that you have written a lot about this in the past, but is there a particular policy issue or a theoretical issue that you thought was confounding this larger North Korean nuclear debate that attracted you to write a whole book project on this?
Yeah, sure. That's a terrific question. I mean, so the earliest concept for the book was really in my mind around late 2017, early 2018, and of course, 2017 was a historic year in terms of the North Korea challenge. That was the year they first time tested an intercontinental range ballistic missile, claimed to have tested a fully staged thermonuclear weapon. Really, I think caught a lot of the world off guard. And for a couple of years prior, I'd been doing some policy writing, making the case that, the way to crack the North Korea problem is to fundamentally, here in the United States, to fundamentally rethink our policy schema towards the country entirely. This notion of only dealing with the North Koreans to get a comprehensive deal that will completely denuclearize them, like previous disarmament agreements in Iraq or Libya or even South Africa, I thought was quite misguided. So that was sort of the fundamental motivator, that I felt that this book, not only should this be a descriptive resource for anybody interested, if somebody's inheriting the North Korea desk at the US State Department or working on non-proliferation issues, even in Delhi, I wanted this to be a book that they could read to acquaint themselves with the North Korea problem. But more seriously, for anybody that might be working on this issue from a non-proliferation perspective, from a North Korea disarmament perspective, I really wanted to sort of lay out the arguments that, time is not really on our side, that sooner rather than later, it will be necessary for policymakers here in the United States, multilaterally at the UN level, to reconceptualize how we think about this problem, lest we end up with a North Korea that has far too many nuclear weapons than any of us would like. Things are still at the point where we are early enough in their breakout that we can move towards that old formula of cap, reduce, eliminate. So that's the main argument that motivated this book. And of course, as you said, I had been doing a lot of writing on this, so the idea of writing a book felt quite natural because I already had this huge body of research on various aspects of the North Korean program.
I know it's going to be very difficult, but can you talk us through this, the broader trajectory of North Korean nuclear program? In particular, what I'm interested in is that how different it has been from other nuclear powers that we know more about. Are there any particular inflection points that you found were very interesting to observe and to conceptualize in terms of looking at that trajectory? And what does it tell us about the broader issue of why countries pursue nuclear weapons?
Yeah, sure. Happy to try to do a crash course on the North Korean nuclear program. So, I mean, the origins of the North Korean nuclear program are in the early days of the Cold War, when Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Un's grandfather and the founding leader of North Korea, like so many leaders around the world, including former South Korean leader Park Chung-hee and others, was looking at the value of nuclear weapons. These were a fairly new technology after they were used in the Second World War in 1945 to strike the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Kim Il Sung was witness to nuclear proliferation early on by the Soviet Union, by China. He was witness to crises in Asia and elsewhere, including the first Taiwan Straits crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis. In fact, an idea that Kim Jong-un later borrows to frame his own nuclear policy. He borrows from a speech that his grandfather gives in late 1962 after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the lesson that Kim Il-sung apparently takes away from the Cuban Missile Crisis is that for a small country like Cuba or a small country like North Korea, relying on an overseas patron to provide security or base nuclear missiles on their territory just won't cut it. That what it really takes is self-reliance with nuclear weapons. But of course, my book is called Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, so I do go over the history, but I mostly focus on the Kim Jong-un era, which began in the final days of 2011, really in 2012. But anyways, by the 1980s, North Korea, in 1985, they, under Soviet pressure, do sign and ratify the NPT. In 1986, their gas graphite reactor at Yongbyon goes critical and comes online for the first time. And by the early 1990s, we have assessments from the United States, from the CIA in particular, saying that the North Koreans have enough plutonium for a couple of nuclear weapons. And that leads us into this era of disarmament. In 1992, North and South Korea begin setting in line the processes that lead to future negotiations on denuclearization. And the book focuses quite a bit on this strange term denuclearization that we use in the context of the Korean Peninsula. And another point that I emphasize is that, the United States had based tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula between 1957 and late 1991. And the removal of those tactical nuclear weapons created the conditions to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. But we were at a point when the only nuclear weapons that existed on the Korean Peninsula were south of the demilitarized zone that separates them. So the early 1990s lead us into this phase where the United States makes North Korea a major part of the non-proliferation policy project. And this is around the it's a very familiar time to scholars studying this issue in India. Obviously, this is the period in which the CTBT is being negotiated, that India and Pakistan have reached their recessed deterrent phases where weaponization is complete and the world is simply waiting for India and Pakistan to conduct their tests, which happened later in 1998. North Korea, of course, conducts its first nuclear test in 2006. It remains the only country to have tested nuclear weapons in the 21st century. It has done so 6 times. Under Kim Jong-un, I think what's significant is that he's really the man who oversees the major milestones for any program. He standardizes and renders compact their nuclear device. He tests a high-yield thermonuclear device. He tests ballistic missiles capable of delivering those nuclear devices to U.S. territories, both in the Pacific and the U.S. homeland. So in the book, I because the book is also written for a layperson, it's not a scholarly book. It is a trade book that I want people who aren't necessarily living, nuclear proliferation day in and day out to make sense of. The way I talk about this is sort of North Korea having a shopping list of things that it needed for its nuclear program. And under Kim Jong-un, a lot of that shopping list really gets completed. And in November 2017, Kim Jong-un declares his deterrent to be complete. And of course, that's a little premature because his deterrent is still in a rudimentary phase. But I think what he meant was that the rudimentary conditions for minimum deterrence in the North Korean view qualitatively had been attained by that time. So they had the ICBM, they had the thermonuclear weapon. And that brings us to present day 2020, where we're still nowhere closer to cracking this problem.
Yeah, so that brings me to this question, of basically conceptualizing this, and those of us who study this, they grew up with these 3-dimensional models: security, domestic politics, and norms. And you touch upon them in your writing in this book also, where you talk of at times status being one factor, and then of course security. which you talk of from internal and external sources, basically security of the regime that matters to Kim Jong-un in particular. And then, of course, you link it with a sort of peculiar domestic political apparatus that is there in North Korea. So when you look at the North Korean case, does it fit, in the sort of larger schema of the academic writing that we have, or the academic modeling that we have? Because, obviously, as you say, this is a trade book. And you don't explicitly deal with them. But there is an undercurrent there, which, whether you're talking of security, whether you're talking of domestic political regime, whether regime matters, or whether status becomes at times important determinant of whether Kim Jong-un would pursue diplomacy or whether he would, go down and talk about nuclear rhetoric. So how do you make sense of this, in terms of conceptualizing this broader academic literature?
Yeah, I mean, so, the subtitle of the book is Survival and Deterrence in North Korea, which I think already tells you where I'm coming from. There is a section in the book where I try to, force the reader to contend a little bit with Ken Waltz, because I think the North Koreans read Ken Waltz, or, they at least behave very much according to Ken Waltz's neorealist ideas about why states might seek nuclear weapons. So for North Korea, which I think fundamentally, even though they talk about self-reliance and it's an important idea for them, during the Cold War, for better or worse, they were rather dependent on the beneficence of their superpower neighbors, right? So the Soviet Union and China. But of course, I talked a bit about Kim Il-sung's mistrust of, delegating one's security out to other countries. So he had this idea that North Korea would need nuclear weapons to survive in this international system that is fundamentally anarchic and hostile to particularly smaller states with more constrained resources. So this current, I think, very much is constant throughout history. So I think security is the most compelling explanation for why the North Koreans felt they needed nuclear weapons. I mean, especially with the during the Cold War, actually, today when we think about the Korean Peninsula, we imagine a technologically sophisticated American and South Korean alliance with conventional precision weapons, advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities that very much is standing up against an obsolete North Korean conventional force. But the conventional balance during much of the Cold War was actually quite different, right? So the North Korean People's Army quantitatively outnumbered the U.S.-South Korea alliance for much of the Cold War, and the qualitative differential in military technology was also much lower earlier on. As time has gone on, that gap has widened considerably. And this is part of the reason why the United States felt that tactical nuclear weapons were necessary to sort of even the odds a little bit. At some time, if we think back to the a little bit of the India-Pakistan dynamic with conventional weakness being offset by tactical nuclear weapons. That was sort of what was driving a lot of U.S. thinking about the value of tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, that there is this massively quantitatively superior conventional army that could one day invade south of the DMZ again. We could have a second Korean War. The North Koreans had artillery, but they didn't have precise missiles. They had Scud missiles in the mid 1980s or so, but it was very rudimentary. So nuclear weapons, when they came to the Korean Peninsula, and even as early as the 1980s, really I think were being pursued with the goal of security. And I talk a lot in the book about how the North Koreans plan to use their nuclear weapons, because of course the credibility of deterrence hinges on the ability of these weapons to be used, or at least North Korea needs to signal that it has a plan to credibly use these weapons. And here we see that the North Koreans have studied how the United States prosecutes wars overseas and prosecutes expeditionary wars. And one of the things that they've learned, not only from the Korean War, but more recently from the Gulf War, from the 2003 invasion of Iraq, from NATO campaigns against Libya, is the importance of logistics and overseas supply. So yes, the U.S. has some 28,500 troops on the Korean Peninsula, and the South Korean military is quite well equipped itself. But a full-scale conflict or an invasion of North Korea would require the United States to ship in supplies and logistics from San Diego, from the west coast of the United States, from Guam, from Hawaii. And the observation that the North Koreans came to was that as long as they can use nuclear weapons to degrade that invading force on the peninsula and off, they have a better shot at survival than a world in which they don't have nuclear weapons. So the explanation that I personally lean towards is the security explanation here for why the North Koreans have these weapons. But of course, it doesn't have to be monocausal. I think prestige explains some behavior we see within the North Korean system, particularly when it comes to I think their submarine-launched nuclear weapons are a little bit of a peculiar project for a country with the kind of resource constraints that they have, and frankly, when you're thinking about, I see a lot of writing about the North Korean submarine-launched nuclear weapons that talk about the need for a secure second strike. But if you look at the rickety, old, obsolete undersea hulls that they're using, Chinese Romeo-class submarines modified to carry ballistic missiles. I mean, these would not be very survivable against the advanced anti-submarine warfare capabilities that the US, South Korea, and Japan have. So why are the North Koreans doing this? We see sort of evidence from the way they talk about things internally in their own propaganda, both internally and to the outside world, that, this is about a little bit of prestige, that the North Koreans want to sit at the table with the world's most advanced nuclear powers. And they even use similar language when they tested a thermonuclear weapon, right? I mean, depending on how you count, I mean, North Korea is plausibly the only country outside of the P5 with a successful test to that degree, right? I know it's a little controversial to talk about the Indian thermonuclear test, but the North Koreans, I think, really presented themselves to the outside world as being sui generis outside of the P5 in many ways. So prestige is an explanation there. Domestic legitimacy is a big part of the story as well. The Kim regime, of course, it does have this peculiar cult of personality and propaganda internally that it sort of rules over with an iron fist. It's a highly monolithic system. But Kim Jong-un, especially when he was, a leader in his late 20s who had just inherited power, and he had to sort of contend with this internal power consolidation project with this somewhat skeptical old guard that has served his father. He demonstrates that he is able to follow through on this broader, longer-term bureaucratic project of realizing the nuclear breakout of the country. So in 2017, when Kim Jong-un declares his deterrent complete, there are significant propaganda events where, North Koreans tell the story of their own nuclear breakout. And Kim Jong-un, Kim Jong-il, his father, and Kim Il-sung, all of their contributions are sort of woven into this one propaganda narrative. So there is also that important domestic aspect.
So, Ankit, just explain to us, why is it, what you explained in the book, it's very a rational actor model almost, very, very a response from North Korean regime, from Kim Jong-un and even his predecessors, which fits into this larger paradigm of how states behave rationally and as they try to preserve or enhance their security. But you also talk about how there persists, and we witness it, I think, almost on an everyday basis, this perception of the regime being almost irrational, that that there is an element of peculiarity about the regime that goes beyond normal behavior, normal quote unquote. So in that sense, and especially when it comes to American policymaking community, there is still a sense that this is not a rational country, this is not a rational regime, and therefore certain policy ventures are out of bounds. Do you think that sort of an approach still persists in the larger body politic of the US? And do you think that poses a problem, the challenge in terms of coming out with a coherent policy framework vis-a-vis North Korea, or is that something that has changed over the last few years?
I don't think it's changed. I mean, in the book, I quote senior American military officials. I quote H.R. McMaster, the National Security Advisor during much of the 2017 crisis, as explicitly making claims that, we couldn't practice long-term deterrence with North Korea because deterrence requires a rational adversary, right? If you're credibly communicating the threat of punishment, an irrational adversary might not then alter their behavior pursuant to that threat. So it matters how we conceptualize North Korean decision-making. And something that, I think I came across, and others have also pointed this out, is that a lot of the things that were being said about Kim Jong-un in 2016, 2017, when he was sort of crossing those important milestones, were very similar, frankly, to things that the American policy community was saying about Mao after 1964, when China conducted its first nuclear test. And of course, when China did that, and the prospect of a non-European power coming to possess nuclear weapons, specifically one, like Mao, who I think, we can make a much more credible argument that Mao is perhaps in many ways a more revolutionary figure than Kim Jong-un, and certainly with rationality, that was also, another issue when the Cultural Revolution came around. But a lot of the arguments were being made in a similar way, that, we simply can't we simply can't tolerate a nuclear armed North Korea because Kim Jong-un, he killed his uncle, he murdered his half brother with chemical weapons in Kuala Lumpur airport. I mean, how can we live with a guy who, does these things and also possesses an ICBM with a thermonuclear capability? So I contend with those arguments in the book. I mean, first of all, Mao, Stalin, leaders who may be culpable for crimes against humanity, and everything else, that has sort of been orthogonal to their possession of nuclear weapons in many cases, i.e. cruelty to one's own people doesn't necessarily predict how you're going to think about nuclear deterrence. So we have to look elsewhere for evidence about how the North Koreans claim to want to use their nuclear weapons. And of course, there is a lot of language in their propaganda that people will cherry pick. I mean, I talk about the pessimists and the optimists in the book, and there are pessimists who think that the grand purpose of North Korea's nuclear weapons is to one day unsheath them, hold them against South Korea's throat, and force South Korea to capitulate. So very much a coercive theory of why North Korea has nuclear weapons. And yeah, I mean, you can look at the propaganda, and there is this notion that's been in North Korean propaganda since 1953, the notion of the final victory, that the Korean War is unfinished business. It is quite literally unfinished business because it did not resolve in a treaty, it resolved in an armistice. So the North Koreans talk about this notion of, one day we will rise up and finally unite the peninsula under our rule. And for North Korea to really, I think, indicate that to the outside world, again, I think to a lot of people, that smacks of irrationality. And I make the case that while that is an important theme in propaganda and has been internally, I don't think that actually describes what they're planning on doing with their nuclear weapons. Because if you look at other declaratory statements that have come out, of course, North Korea didn't publish a nuclear doctrine or anything like that. But there is a body of text that has come out from the country, statements by senior military officials, statements by Kim Jong-un, frankly, things that they do when they test missiles. They'll have a map showing targets and trajectories where they want you to understand what they're trying to communicate. All of this points to, I think, a much more rational model of nuclear strategy. I mean, quite similar, actually, to the Pakistani concept, just without tactical nuclear weapons. They have sort of a very unique deterrence problem that no other country has, which is that they have a contiguous neighbor with a conventional advantage. So there we get some similarities to South Asia, but then they have another problem, which is that they have the world's foremost superpower on the other side of the planet, also interested in constraining their strategic room for action. So that's why they have this two-tier nuclear force with the intercontinental range systems and then the regional systems. And at the risk of, I was very aware of hyper rationalizing the North Koreans, since that can be a problem in folks who write about nuclear strategy, taking some things about nuclear weapons that are fundamentally absurd and making them fit into these very clean, rational frameworks. So there are, places where I have serious concerns about North Korea's nuclear strategy. For instance, it is highly offensively oriented. It is very much prone to crisis instability. In the early days of North Korea's breakout, particularly as they remain, less confident about things like their command and control. And this is why I think the 2017 crisis was so dangerous, because the North Koreans are a very young power. They don't quite know, or they haven't quite contended with the burdens of operating a nuclear force, particularly things like command and control. So that encourages them to posture their forces in ways that, to go back to shelling, really play into that brinksmanship model of teetering at the cliff and inviting your adversary to dance with you on the cliff, because you know that you then risk both falling off. And the North Koreans are very good at brinksmanship. So that was, I think, the concept that I had of how the North Koreans can be described as rational. But yeah, I mean, there is still this lingering mistrust in the United States that this is a country that fundamentally can't be trusted to possess nuclear weapons in the long term.
So when you talk about their evolution of the nuclear program, there are three external actors that are very, very important: China, Russia, and of course Pakistan. I would like you to talk a bit about them, given that, what kind of roles these three countries played, and how that continues to impinge on the evolution of the nuclear trajectory of North Korea.
Yeah, sure. So here we're mostly talking about the proliferation story, which is, to be completely frank, a lot of the proliferation story over the last 30, 40 years, there are big gaps in the story. There are some parts that remain unexplained and probably will remain unexplained. until when the regime collapses, and like Iraq, we can go into their archives and hopefully fill in the gaps here and there. But yeah, let me talk about some of the major players in this proliferation story. Let's begin with Pakistan, because I think that's the probably the most interesting one to audiences in South Asia. So Pakistan obviously is infamous for its role in proliferation, not only in the North Korean case but elsewhere. So A.Q. Khan, Abdul Qadir Khan, the father of the Pakistani nuclear bomb and the father of, in many ways, North Korea's at least uranium program, is a big figure in the book. So I talk about the so at one point in time, there are two paths to a nuclear weapon. You can use plutonium 239 or uranium 235. Natural uranium, abundant in North Korea, was only good for use in the gas graphite reactor at Yongbyon. That runs on natural uranium fuel rods. So the North Koreans didn't have a domestic enrichment capacity, especially at the time of the 1994 agreed framework. In the 1990s, however, the North Koreans were quite active with the Pakistanis, and this included, during Benazir Bhutto's term as prime minister, included very important high-level interactions. And effectively, what happened with the Pakistanis is a very convenient barter. So after A.Q. Khan had sort of freelanced and offered the North Koreans enrichment technology in the form of his centrifuges, the Pakistanis, in return from the North Koreans, basically received access to the Nodong medium-range missile. And this exists today in Pakistan as the Gori, which continues to be tested. I believe it was tested not that long ago, actually, last year. So that was a convenient barter between the Pakistanis and the North Koreans. A.Q. Khan also makes some curious claims about North Korea. He claims to have seen a compact nuclear weapon in the country much before they even tested a device. So that, I think, makes us rethink a little bit about the timeline of when the North Koreans had what. I mean, had they weaponized a nuclear weapon in the 1990s only to test in 2006? And of course, it shows you the importance of testing, because when they did test for the first time, their weapon fizzled. It did not perform as they desired. So that's a bit on the Pakistan angle. The relationship there continues. The North Korean Pakistan story, in many ways, remains unfinished. There are continuing interactions there, not in terms of direct proliferation, but diplomatically. I know it's a major concern in New Delhi, for instance, concerns about Pakistan proliferating to North Korea in the future. China's role is, of course, central. That said, I do want to emphasize something that comes up in debates here in the United States and elsewhere, which is that North Korea is not a Chinese client state. So a lot of policy proposals for North Korea, hinge on this idea that, well, if we just told China to reel in the North Koreans, all of our problems will be solved. And the North Koreans very much don't perceive themselves as in China's pocket. They don't perceive themselves as a Chinese vassal state. They never have. They've caused as much trouble for the Chinese as really any neighbor in many ways. During the early days of the Cold War, in particular, Kim Il-sung actually perceived that there was an attempt by the Chinese Communist Party to stage a coup against him. Really, there's early evidence that the North Koreans just mistrust the Chinese Communist Party in many ways. But that said, military cooperation between China and North Korea has been robust, particularly during the Cold War. You had North Korean technicians participating in indigenous ballistic missile development programs in China. That sort of fizzled a little bit after the Sino-Soviet split, and for a variety of reasons, the Soviet Union did emerge as an important partner. That said, both China and North Korea, when it comes to the issue of nuclear proliferation to North Korea, particularly in recent years, have both opposed the idea of having another nuclear armed state on their border. So nominally, China does oppose this, and it continues to, in 2017, China voted for unprecedented sanctions against North Korea. But of course, from a geopolitical perspective, China sees some value to having North Korea as a buffer between American forces in South Korea and its own territory. The Russia side, okay, look, so like many leaders in the world in the 1980s, the North Koreans had no idea that the Soviet Union was about to collapse. So when they signed the NPT in 1985, they likely did so with several assumptions about what the world would look like for the next 20, 30 years, and that included Soviet patronage. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was sort of a major crisis for the North Koreans. And that sort of marks the moment, honestly, that North Korea and South Korea economically diverge. around the time of the 1988 Seoul Olympics. The two economies are comparable. And of course, North Korea, after the end of the Cold War, is in this plateau, this rut, and South Korea is now one of the richest countries in the world. But the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major source of a loss of patronage for them. But of course, the Soviets were quite careful about the kinds of technologies that they gave the North Koreans. So even though they established a research reactor for the North Koreans, they did not provide them with enrichment capacity. So the North Koreans had to import all of their high enriched uranium to use for their nuclear research from the Soviet Union in the 1970s. The ballistic missile component is interesting. The North Koreans actually received their first ballistic missiles from the Egyptians, who sent the North Koreans missiles that they had procured from the Soviet Union. So the Egyptians had Scuds from the Soviet Union that they gave the North Koreans in exchange for North Korean air support during the Yom Kippur War. So again, a little bit of a barter arrangement. But where Russia comes into the picture is after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia had this massive defense industrial complex. So you had all of these missile engineers and scientists who were out of work, making 20% of their salaries in the 1980s. And a lot of them simply went to North Korea. And I talk a little bit in the book about this very famous incident of scores of scientists from this one Russian or Soviet city called the Makayev Bureau, and these guys were all caught at Moscow airport en route to Pyongyang. So then that raises the question: what about the guys who weren't caught? And here's a big gap in our story. There is potentially this population of freelancing post-Soviet scientists who have been probably making a decent living either in or outside of North Korea, assisting the North Korean program, because the design heritage that we see for many of the new impressive missiles that North Korea has are based on Soviet designs. So there are puzzles here. But yeah, that's a very quick crash course on the proliferation story.
No, that's very, very interesting, and I think much as this whole discussion on the causes and evolution of the program is fascinating. I think the real issue now is is the consequences of and then your book is all about accepting North Korea as a de facto nuclear weapon state and therefore framing policies accordingly. So I just wanted to come to some of those consequences aspect of this issue. One which is, I think, of particular interest in the South Asian context is that something that you've alluded to in your previous comments as well. Very interesting parallels that you draw between South Asia and Northeast Asia. Not only the fact that the predicament, the structural predicament, is the same for sort of a country like Pakistan and North Korea, but also what it results in, the classic stability-instability paradox, and how that might manifest itself in the North Korean context. So, and this also speaks to us, in terms of some of the contemporary debates in South Asia itself about tactical nukes, how India should respond, what potentially can Pakistan do about it. So I think if you can talk, a bit about those parallels, and where do you see that conversation going, especially on the issue of tactical nukes and how they impact this conversation about nuclear proliferation and non-proliferation broadly.
Sure. Yeah. So, tactical nuclear weapons, which I alluded to a little bit, so those don't actually exist yet in North Korea. So there are certain systems that they've tested since 2017 that I think, if they did want to do tactical nuclear weapons or lower yield nuclear weapons, those would make decent delivery systems. They have the diameter to accommodate a small nuclear warhead. Actually, they have the diameter to even accommodate their standardized fission warhead if they really wanted to, and that's thought to be a 30 kiloton yield system, so not tactical by regional nuclear power standards, albeit by American and Soviet standards certainly. So that hasn't been an issue yet, but yeah, I mean, the predicament of relying on first use being the one to lower the nuclear threshold to deter your conventional adversary is very much part and parcel of the North Korean plan, right? They intend to use their Scuds, their medium-range missiles against targets in Japan, primarily airfields, American military targets, missile defense installations, early in a crisis to significantly degrade the ability to carry out an invasion. I think though, when I think about South Asia, and we think about the consequences of a nuclear North Korea, a lot, comes back to actually the non-proliferation consequences, right? So here, I think we have important differences. So India, Pakistan obviously never signed the NPT, and will likely never sign the NPT. And of course, you ask policymakers in the U.S., China, any P5 country really, and you ask them, did you accept India or China as a nuclear weapon state? You get different answers depending on who you ask. Certainly in the United States, right? I mean, formally, the answer is no. Both countries remain outside of the legitimate club of the 5 nuclear weapon states in the NPT. But for the purposes of policy, of course we do. I mean, thinking about American policy in South Asia since 1998 has very much relied on converging strategically with a nuclear-armed India, and that egg was sort of cracked in 2005 with the Civil Nuclear Agreement. And it's about managing nuclear risks when India and Pakistan come close to conflict. So, I mean, these issues loom large for policymakers. And very much in a similar way, the fact of North Korea's nuclear possession is already something that American military planners are contending with, right? I mean, you would be negligent as a military planner to go about your business on the Korean Peninsula as if it was 2005. I mean, it's not. The U.S. military is quite open. I mean, they have started doing exercises and simulations for conducting operations in the aftermath of a nuclear attack, for instance. Those exercises had never happened, to my knowledge, before 2017. So there again, if you're the North Koreans, you see evidence that the credibility of your deterrent is beginning to manifest in your opponent's mind, because the point at which they're starting to conduct those kinds of exercises tells you quite a bit. But also, I mean, the big argument, I'll be careful about the argument that I make in the book, which is that I basically make the case for this very neutral term, which is coexistence, that we need to basically acknowledge this reality, deal with North Korea as it is, and reformulate our policy to reduce dangers in the short term because of this very offensively oriented North Korean nuclear strategy that inherently manifests in crisis instability when we get close to the brink. We're not at the brink today for a variety of reasons. Things are quite quiet on the Korean Peninsula. But if we do return to a time like 2017, I would like for our policy to, frankly, be based more in realistic assumptions about the North Koreans. But of course, the counter argument is, North Korea represents a unique challenge to the non-proliferation regime, and really in a different way than India, Pakistan, or Israel. And that is because they are the only country to have signed and ratified the NPT and claim to have withdrawn in 2003, successfully tested and broken out as a nuclear power. So basically, the big counter argument to the coexistence argument is, what are we telling other proliferators in the future? If Iran decides it wants to get a nuclear weapon, what did Iran learn from the way North Korea went about its business? And yes, I mean, it's not an enviable position to be in. Policy is all about trade-offs. And ultimately, the case that I make is that the benefits to Northeast Asian and global security that we derive from dealing with North Korea in a more realistic way outweigh the costs to the non-proliferation regime, which frankly is under stress from a variety of sources. It's not just North Korea. It's about the fraying of the 2015 JCPOA. It's about the credibility of American extended deterrence guarantees fraying under the Trump administration. I mean, non-proliferation is under stress, and North Korea is part of that story. But dealing with the real nuclear dangers that exist on the Korean Peninsula is sort of my top priority. But yes, I mean, I think that's an important difference to emphasize between South Asia and North Korea. I also in the book, talk a bit about how the North Koreans are actually quite open-minded about imagining geopolitical realities in the future with the United States. So North Korean negotiators, for instance, have told their American counterparts that what they really want at the end of the day is something like the India deal. I mean, they want to have a fundamentally different geopolitical relationship with the United States, with the benefits of civil nuclear power while they retain their nuclear power, while they retain their nuclear weapons. And the case that they made, and at least what they learned from the U.S.-India story, is that when the United States makes a decision that a certain country has strategic value for American interests in a region, it's very much willing to rewrite the rules on non-proliferation to do business. And I guess that was something that many in the non-proliferation community here in the United States feared at the time. But at least for the North Koreans, the Americans have made the case that North Korea is not India. It's not a democracy of 1.3 billion people. It doesn't have the same strategic relevance to the future of Asian security, for instance. So quite frankly, North Korea is never going to get that deal. But I think it does, tell us quite a bit about how North Korea fits into the broader story of the last 20 years or so when it comes to non-proliferation.
Yes, it's quite quite fascinating in terms of the lessons that countries learn from others, and how that they are incorporated in policy making and diplomacy. You talk about just now. You also referred to it in terms of American security guarantees and American role in Northeast Asia. And that that in some ways has also been at the back of the mind of the policymakers. This whole idea of proliferation begetting proliferation. Now, North Korea, if you say that North Korea has to be dealt with as a de facto nuclear weapon state, what message is being conveyed to South Korea or to Japan about their proliferation ambitions? And in the context of already fraying American security guarantees or already fraying security situation in Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, do you see this proliferation problem becoming more acute, or are there checks and balances in place at the moment that you see will hold?
Right. I mean, yeah, so this is something I contend with quite a bit in the book. It's something that's on the top of my mind as part of my research agenda right now. Yes, there will be proliferation pressures in South Korea and Japan, and they will be quiet because obviously we have the NPT, and neither South Korea nor Japan is going to come out and tell us that they no longer intend to behave as non-nuclear weapon states in good standing under the NPT. They both continue to do that. But from the nuclear latency point of view, South Korea, of course, used to have a nuclear weapons program. In fact, a big part of the North Korean nuclear story is reacting to the South Korean nuclear weapons program when it became apparent that they had one. Japan, meanwhile, obviously, very sensitive history with nuclear weapons as the only country to have suffered at the hands of nuclear weapons. But of course, Japanese policymakers are quite clear-eyed about the value that nuclear deterrence plays in their national defense. So they're not going to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. They very much rely on the American willingness to use nuclear weapons first to defend Japanese interests. Japan, of course, from a nuclear latency perspective, again, a country that would be able to break out quite quickly. They're sitting on mountains of reactor-grade plutonium in their country. South Korea is investing in delivery systems that would be very easily repurposed for nuclear delivery if it came to that. But anyways, I mean, all of this is a moot point because of the NPT, and because the United States continues to formally, at least, uphold its treaty commitments. So the challenge going forward is for us to remember here in the United States that extended deterrence. I mean, in the earliest days of the Cold War, extended deterrence was one of the most important tools we had in the non-proliferation toolkit, right? And we failed in certain ways. I mean, if you look at the story of why France broke out as a independent nuclear power, it was because, I mean, frankly, Charles de Gaulle didn't believe that that the United States would be willing to use nuclear weapons to defend Paris in exchange for New York once the Soviet Union's got an intercontinental range capability. And many of these same tensions now exist in Northeast Asia. So the practice, the problem for us is now to be better allies, better alliance managers when it comes to this issue of extended deterrence. It's a very tricky time for this. I mean, because we have the Trump administration, which frankly has completely rewritten the book on how the United States treats its allies. You have a debate on the Democratic side of the aisle on ideas like no first use or sole purpose, which, again, I think leave our allies in Northeast Asia a little bit uncomfortable because the credible threat of American nuclear first use, for whatever reason, is something that the South Koreans and the Japanese perceive to be a very important component of nuclear deterrence, extended deterrence against both China and North Korea. So yeah, these issues are, I think, something that we'll have to honestly contend with in the future. But that said, I mean, there's no imminent sign that either South Korea or Japan are thinking about breaking out.
So Ankit, we are running out of time, but I have two questions, final questions for you. One is just looking ahead. In terms of American foreign policy, and in particular American policy towards Northeast Asia. Do you see any big shift with the Biden administration if it comes to power in Washington? In a sense, because there are multiple issues on the agenda, the whole logic of non-proliferation, there is this issue of alliances, there is a larger Cold War brewing between US and China, and that will have its impact on Northeast Asia. So in a sense, do you foresee a departure from the present trajectory, a significant departure if that happens? And what will be the consequences for the North Korean question?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second one, and I'll end with the Biden administration. So, yeah, this geopolitical, great power competition, or whatever you want to call it, is already manifesting on the Korean Peninsula, right? So one of the obvious ways is that China and Russia simply have lost the will to implement sanctions. So we haven't really talked about sanctions today, and I'm frankly glad about that, because I think too many conversations about North Korea, assess the value of sanctions, and I think we all know that sanctions are very unlikely to cause a state like North Korea to strategically reevaluate the role that nuclear weapons play in its national defense. But China and Russia just simply are easing off on sanctions implementation. But as this competition intensifies, I think China will continue to see North Korea as a useful cudgel against the United States. We probably won't get to that point where North Korea and the United States will fundamentally reevaluate their relationship to the point where, we might have a Vietnam-style story where a nuclear-armed North Korea becomes a U.S. partner in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, that's very unlikely to happen in the short term. But China will, I think, leverage North Korea in this competition. The second question about Biden, on the Democratic side of the aisle, and if you were watching the Democratic debates in the primary, you saw this when North Korea came up. There is a philosophical clash right now, right? There are people on sort of my side of the camp, making the case that let's be realistic and let's do a step-by-step process with the North Koreans. And there are people who are more content to go back to the 2016 era Obama policy, which is, we'll sanction and we'll wait for the North Koreans to realize that these sanctions are simply too much of a hassle. So very similar to the Trump maximum pressure approach in that sense. And as best I can tell, at least in things that have floated to the public from internal deliberations of the Biden campaign, this dynamic has yet to be resolved. So if Biden does win, there will be a policy review on the North Korea question, and that'll probably take 4 to 6 months. So by mid-2021, we should know where they are on this question, in addition to a range of other foreign policy topics. But it is at least encouraging to see this discussion. There are also, near-term developments that might simply force the Biden administration's hand. I mean, the North Koreans are supposed to have a military parade just in a couple weeks. If at this parade they show us, as some of us think they might, scores of nuclear-capable missile launchers capable of ranging Japan and South Korea. They've never done that. I mean, if quantitatively the North Korean program simply gets to this point where, you'd have to be absolutely delusional to deal with this country as a non-proliferation problem versus a deterrence and disarmament problem. If the North Koreans do that, I mean, can the Biden administration really credibly come into office and say, we're just going to hold out and wait for sanctions to change the North Koreans' calculus? I don't think so. So wait and see, but it is something that's encouraging, at least from my perspective, that there is this debate happening.
Excellent. So, this has been a fascinating discussion, but I have to ask you one final question about Kim Jong-un. Do you have any information other than what we get in the media as to what is happening at the moment inside North Korea, inside the power struggle? There have been some reports about him not being well. There have been reports about his sister being emerging as a power center. Do you think that internal, of course, there is a sense that internal calculations matter and internal politics is a very important factor. But in terms of short to medium term, if you were to look at the internal dynamic, do you see any major shift there, or do you think that Kim Jong-un is placed well enough not to rock, so that there's no rocking of boat, at least in the short to medium term?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a power struggle. I think his power remains consolidated. On the health issue, look, there were all sorts of reports. The original report that came from Daily NK suggesting it was a very modestly phrased report that then went through the news cycle several times and came out as something completely different. I think the claim was that he had some heart procedure, and far be it for me to diagnose anyone from afar. I'm not a doctor. But you look at the guy, he's in his mid-30s. He's not the picture of perfect health. So I imagine that it is something that the North Koreans take into account. It is one of the risks I talk about in my book, which is that you have this, you have a dictator with nuclear weapons under his control without an obvious heir. What happens if one day he doesn't wake up or, has a little bit too much to drink? We just don't know. That is a source of risk. His sister is an interesting figure. I think she's clearly a trusted advisor. She is clearly receiving some form of delegated authority, but she herself doesn't have authority at the level of a supreme leader, right? So she's still if you look at the bureaucratic title she holds within the North Korean system, There are other men who are unrelated to the Kim family that are nominally above her. That said, she has evoked her brother's authority to take certain decisions, which is something that nobody else in the North Korean system can ever do. So she's an interesting figure. And, there are questions about how does authority devolve in North Korea. For instance, in a conflict, if a precision strike by the United States kills Kim Jong-un, who inherits nuclear launch authority? It is Kim Jong-un is the only person in North Korea with the authority to authorize a nuclear launch. They don't have delegated nuclear launch authority. So does that go to Kim Yo-jong? Does it go to Kim Rak-gyom, who's the commander of the strategic rocket forces? Does it go to the premier? We don't know, but a lot of fascinating leadership dynamics there. But I think it's something we'll probably get more information about in due time as well.
And lots to keep you busy in the coming days and weeks and months and years. So thank you, Ankit, for joining us today. It was a fascinating discussion, and I think the whole issue of sitting here in South Asia, looking at this proliferation dynamic emerging in Northeast Asia is equally fascinating, because in South Asia we are so consumed by the India-Pakistan dynamic and increasingly by India-China dynamic, where you may have observed there are elements of tactical nukes already being discussed in that dynamic as well. So I think we are looking at some of that larger issues around nuclear proliferation emerging, and I think hopefully there's a lot of learning to be made both by academics and policymakers across various geographical domains. So thank you for joining us. And those of you who are watching us, this is an excellent book. And I think perhaps the first one, are there other books, Ankit, on North Korean nuclear program?
So I mean, just for other reading, Jonathan Pollock's No Exit, which was a IISS, a Delphi paper from 2011, I believe, is an excellent resource on the Kim Jong-il era. My book is sort of the first one to focus exclusively on the Kim Jong-un era. I happen to know that there are a few more underway. It is a renaissance right now in North Korea books. On the 2017 crisis, there's Van Jackson's On the Brink. Anna Fifield's book on Kim Jong-un is an excellent biography. Jung Pak, former CIA analyst, also has written a profile of Kim Jong-un that's quite good. So there are a few books, but mine's the one that only it's dealing with deterrence and the North Korean nuclear force exclusively. So as far as I know, it's the only one right now.
Great book. Thank you, Ankit, for a fascinating conversation, and more books to you and more power to your pen. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you. I really enjoyed this, Harsh.